Hello. Today I am going to be giving a presentation that I gave last year at the 2019 conference called Unit Structures, The Art of Cecil Taylor, which was hosted by the CUNY Graduate Center and Brooklyn College in New York. And it is a paper that I wrote presenting a system of gestural composition and analysis using the music of Cecil Taylor. The title of the talk is Musical Gesture in Analysis, Gestrue-Class as a Formal Structure. In this talk, I'm going to propose a gesture-based method for analyzing Cecil Taylor's music. This method is useful from both a listening perspective as well as from a compositional or improvisational perspective. My interest in Cecil Taylor's music began during my undergraduate composition studies, where my professor, Stephen Dembski, introduced me to Cecil's music. I didn't really know what to do with it at first, but I loved its sense of play and visceral motion. My first inkling on how I might deal with this music theoretically came from studying the music of Franco Donatoni, which is in some ways very different from Cecil Taylor's, but in some important aspects regarding musical evolution and modularity, very similar. So I ended up working out an analytical method, departing from Donatoni's system of figuras, or motivic units, in order to bring gesture into the conversation. A couple notes before we begin. First, my talk will be almost entirely devoid of discussion regarding specific pitch and harmony. While these are undoubtedly important aspects of Cecil Taylor's music, I want to discuss more abstracted types of analysis, which I have been able to generalize and incorporate into my own compositions and improvisations. A second note is that in my research for this topic, I frequently found sources suggesting that Cecil Taylor himself was quite resistant to much strict theorizing about music, wishing that people would listen to the essentially blues content rather than the things brought from the conservatory. This is a paraphrase of a Cecil Taylor quote from the A.B. Spellman book, Black Music, Four Lives. The resistance to theorizing has been a source of difficulty for me since embarking on this project, and has led me to wonder who is really benefiting from the move to incorporate improvisers into the canons of music theory. Not sure. However, with that in mind, I offer this as a potential framework for understanding his music rather than as an imposition of some kind of truth claim about his music. The piece of music that I will be using to illustrate my system of gesture classification is Cecil Taylor's 1973 album and improvisation, INDENT. This album is a large-scale solo improvisation in 3 sections, or layers, as described on the album track list. My analysis will focus solely on the first layer of this improvisation. For a great look into the second layer, read Lynette Westendorf's 1995 article for Perspectives of New Music called Cecil Taylor Indent, Second Layer. To begin, let's think about the meaning of the term gesture. This is probably the most troubling but crucial portion of my proposed analysis. The term gesture, with respect to music, can refer to a physical sound-producing act, or, in a more abstract sense, to a sound that metaphorically invokes a sense of motion from one point to another. Examples of physical sound-producing gestures include the bowing of a cello string, the striking of a xylophone key, or the strumming of strings on a guitar. Basically any movement that results in a sound. Metaphorical invocations of motion, on the other hand, tend to be much more subjective and are almost certainly culturally contingent in how they are understood. Examples of metaphorical gestures could be a rapidly descending scale, which could be heard as a metaphorical invocation of some kind of downward motion. And right there is where the cultural contingency comes into place, as not all musical cultures associate height differentials with frequency relations and not necessarily in that particular direction. Another example of a metaphorical gesture could be a trill, which might be heard as some kind of fast repetitive motion that is directionally static. What should be apparent at this point is that in my descriptions of metaphorical gesture, I'm using fairly wordy and subjective language. I'm still working on coming up with more elegant language to describe these gestures. But, given the relationship between the physical and metaphorical with respect to gesture, I propose this as a definition moving forward. Musical gesture a distinctive piece of musical material that metaphorically expresses a physical motion, either literal or abstract. Since we haven't heard any music yet, here are a few basic examples illustrating what I am thinking about as musical gestures. In order to take this idea of musical gesture and abstract it into more generalized units, which is useful in both composition and analysis, I propose the idea of a gesture class. This is similar in some ways to a pitch class or interval class, and I define it as a categorization of musical gestures into generalized types or classes of gestures based on shared traits or criteria. These shared traits could be pitch contour, dynamic contour, articulation profile, energy profile, or any number of other characteristics. The utility of this classification allows for musical gestures to be compared to one another as discrete units. Now, let's take a look at a few examples of gesture classes drawn from Cecil Taylor's album INDENT. The first example comes from the opening of INDENT, and is really the primary gesture class explored over most of this improvisation. Almost all of the other gestural content is derived from this gesture class in some way. I'm going to play the opening of INDENT, where Cecil Taylor repeats this gesture class again and again and again. This audio example will repeat this gesture class 4 times. I have intentionally chosen to give these examples as a combination of verbal and graphic depictions, rather than in standard notation for a couple of reasons. Primarily, that the visual and verbal representations of these gesture classes allows for an abstracted system that moves outside the discussion of pitch-based harmony or grid-based rhythms, while giving something somewhat concrete to examine. As I mentioned before, I am still working on creating a more elegant system to represent these gesture classes. The second example is the secondary piece of gestural content in the first layer of indent. I will show later how this gesture class is actually based on a seed introduced in the first example. This third example is sort of the Cecil Taylor specialty gesture class. It's a sound that I just associate with Cecil Taylor and feel is so viscerally gestural. So many of Cecil's improvisations end up in this gesture class at some point, and I would imagine that you could guess what this gesture class will sound like if you know Cecil Taylor's music before I even play this example. As Cecil Taylor's music exists in a highly improvisatory space, the movements and transitions among these gesture classes is often less defined than the movement between pitch class sets in serial music. In order to address this, I propose the idea of gestural flow, whereby gesture classes blend in and out of each other. One gesture class might contain the seeds of another gesture class, which can sprout from it, so to speak. For a definition, I propose gestural flow, the seamless transition, blend, or crossfade from one gesture class to another. Here we have the opening gesture class of indent. Then that same gesture class is repeated, but in a lower register. Then it is repeated again, but back in the higher register. Then again in the lower. This can be seen conceptually as an alteration of discrete units, thus giving rise and context for the second gesture class. If we listen to the first 15 seconds or so of the first layer of indent, we hear how Cecil Taylor winds up at the second gesture class by exploring registral alterations of the first gesture class. The last term I want to discuss is what I call gesture-class sets. Similar to pitch-class sets, these can be seen as harmonic units, but created out of the combination of gesture classes rather than pitch classes. You could call them gestural chords or something like that. These are some graphic examples of what gesture class sets might be. I've actually experimented with a few pieces of music that try to derive a sense of functional harmony out of groups of gesture class sets. Here's an example of a gesture class set from about 10 minutes into the first layer of indent. I have represented this gesture class set in both pseudo-set notation, borrowed from set class language, as well as graphic representation. The pseudo-set notation is above the graphic and says walking bass and upward runs, and the graphic notation is below, showing depictions of what these gestures might look like. Now, let's take a listen to a little bit of the first layer of indent, and I will illustrate these gestural changes as we go. What I find fun about this type of listening is that I start to hear the gesture classes as characters interacting with each other and changing over time. Some of the animation in this video tries to capture a few of the gesture class alterations, showing how a gesture class can maintain its identity while undergoing various permutations. Moving on now to how the system has been useful to me compositionally, I want to discuss how gesture classes and gesture class sets can actually be used harmonically, and often are in all sorts of music, but not usually conceived as such. When I first started mapping out the gesture class content of this improvisation, I noticed that Cecil Taylor tended to create interactions between 2 or 3 gestures at a time, which made me think of functional harmony and motion between tonic, dominant, and subdominant functions. This made me wonder if it was possible to develop functional gestural harmony. So in the spirit of Cecil Taylor, I decided to see if I could create a blues using gesture classes as my harmonic content. What I tried to develop were tonic, dominant, and subdominant functions based out of musical gestures associated with blues performance: bends, slides, falls, growls, etc. In developing this gestural blues, I had to consider a few main issues. One being the energy profiles of the functions of harmony. The tonic is generally stable and at rest, while the dominant tends to have a high degree of tension. From there, I considered the energy profiles of the gestures themselves. Trills might have a lot of tension, but they might not imply much directional motion, whereas scales have a strong sense of directionality, but their speed greatly alters their sense of tension. The third thing I tried to address was to find specific gestures often used in blues performance: bends, falls, slides, wails, etc., as simply assigning 1, 4, and 5 functions to gesture-class sets seem to be missing any even mildly deep or nuanced connection to the blues. The final consideration was how to deal with the fact that the blues has a melodic aspect beyond its common 12-bar harmonic structure. So, with these considerations in mind, I would like to present a piece that I wrote, which I see as a test of and practical engagement with these ideas. It is titled Another Blank, and it follows a basic 12-bar blues structure. The easiest way to read this score is as a basic chord chart, with the rhythm section playing the gestural chords and the soloist playing a gestural solo over the top. With the tonic chord represented by the accented staccato glissando gesture-class set, the subdominant chord represented by the slap scratches scales arpeggios gesture-class set, and the dominant chord represented by the trills tremolo and sustain notes chords gesture-class set. From these gesture-class sets, I created a linear arrangement of the gesture classes. This allows for a scale of gesture classes complete with the notion of consonance and dissonance based on whether you are playing a, quote, chord gesture, kind of like a chord tone, or not. This gestural scale is pictured at the bottom. To get a sense for how this would go, let's take a listen to a little bit of this piece. I hope this video has provided you with a new way of thinking about listening to the music of Cecil Taylor on how to incorporate gestural listening and gestural classification into your own practice. Thanks!